Good evening, traveler. You've wandered into myth-taken dreams, a place where timelines tangle, truths wobble, and bedtime stories rewrite history just enough to make it magical. Each tale unfolds from a library that never existed, where historians whisper with poets and facts arrive fashionably late. Tonight, we unspool another tale from the flickering archive because bedtime deserves a version of history to pique the imagination. So fluff your pillow, turn down the logic, and lean into the lore. Once upon a time, in a world full of very ordinary things, like oceans full of goo, volcanoes that kept on grumbling, and mountains that had yet to figure out how to grow trees, there were tiny little creatures floating around in the oceans, minding their own business. These creatures weren't particularly good at much, except eating what was available and making more of themselves. They were very basic, a bit like the first few pages of a very long book where you're not sure if you want to keep reading yet. But one fine day, one of these little creatures, who was absolutely not going to win any awards for creativity, let's call it Cellus Lazius, had a brilliant idea. Now, this was not a big, flashy idea that involved flying machines or painting on cave walls. Oh no. Cellus Lazius was far too sensible for such things. Instead, it thought, what if, just for fun, I try breathing in a bit of carbon dioxide and turning it into oxygen? Now, this idea was so unremarkable that if you told someone about it, they'd probably shrug and say, sure, why not? We all have days when we want to try breathing in new things. But here's where things got interesting. Cellus Lazius, and other little creatures like it, did start doing it. They ate the carbon dioxide, and poof, out came oxygen. The oxygen wasn't much at first, just a few bubbles here and there, and no one was particularly impressed. After all, it's not like you could walk around and say, hey, look at me, I'm making oxygen. It was like making an invisible potion, but without any sparkles. Now, Earth. The planet, not the person, because Earth doesn't really have legs or a proper name tag, was a little concerned about this whole oxygen thing. You see, it had been rather cozy with a nice, comfortable atmosphere full of carbon dioxide and methane. It didn't really know what to do with oxygen. Oxygen was flamboyant. It didn't like to stay in one place. It liked to react with things like iron and rock and other oxygen, and suddenly things would rust or catch on fire, and nobody had time for that. So Earth thought, maybe I should have a word with these little creatures. But it was too late. These little creatures, who were really good at multiplying, in the way that the most annoying things always seem to be, just kept on turning carbon dioxide into oxygen. They were so good at it, in fact, that the amount of oxygen in the oceans and the air started to rise, like the world's most confusing and most unpredictable balloon slowly inflating. And then, something quite unexpected happened. The more oxygen there was, the more life forms that relied on it started to appear. You see, some creatures who had been living in the shadows, let's call them sneaky creatures, thought, oxygen sounds much better than carbon dioxide. We'll use it. We'll eat it up and turn it into more us. And so, these sneaky creatures, who were definitely not making any oxygen themselves, started taking advantage of the situation. They were the first of what we would later call oxygen-breathing creatures, or more simply, animals. But they had to give oxygen credit. Without it, they'd still be too busy sitting in the corner of the universe, complaining about the lack of a decent snack. However, not everyone was thrilled about all this oxygen. In fact, there was a rather significant grumble from the old guard. These were the creatures who had been happily living in the atmosphere and oceans for millions of years with no need for oxygen whatsoever. They were the methane breathers, the carbon dioxide dwellers. Though we're perfectly happy without any of that bright and shiny O2 stuff, thank you very much. They were used to the good old days, and now, suddenly, oxygen was everywhere. It was like someone had invited a loud, over-enthusiastic band to a very quiet dinner party. And what did oxygen do when it was invited to a dinner party? It reacted with everything. With rocks, with metals, with the very molecules that made up the creatures who had been living in peace. It was like a party crasher who didn't just bring party hats, but also balloons, confetti, and a dancing bear. In other words, oxygen started making things rust, which was a bit of a problem for the older creatures who weren't ready for it. This time is what we call the Great Oxygenation Event, or the Great Oxygen Overload, a time when oxygen took over the planet, turning everything upside down and a little bit rusty. Earth was now going through a very awkward phase in its life, much like a teenager discovering how much it loves music, but no one else quite gets it. Eventually, however, oxygen and Earth came to a mutual understanding. The old methane breathers went into hiding. Many of them went underground or lived in places where the oxygen wasn't too abundant, like caves, or far from the atmosphere. Meanwhile, the new oxygen-breathing creatures, those animals, were thrilled. After all, they were the next big thing. Thanks to oxygen, they could now breathe and move about in ways that were impossible before. And so the world slowly adjusted. The oxygen didn't stop bubbling up. No, it filled the skies and oceans, while the creatures who could use it thrived. Life, as it turns out, was rather fond of oxygen. The moral of the story is this. Sometimes the world changes in ways that seem, at first, like a complete disaster. A little oxygen here, a little rust there. Who knew? But in the end, it makes life a whole lot more exciting. You just have to be careful about how much oxygen you bring to a party. Too much, and things might catch fire. The end, or rather the beginning, again.